The glint of the late afternoon sun off the small, clear vial in Cassandra's hand was what caught my eye first. She was standing near the drinks table, partially obscured by the overflowing hibiscus bush, her back mostly to the lively chatter of the family barbecue. My wife, Clara, was laughing with her aunt by the pool, a joyous sound that always made me smile. Cassandra, Clara's younger, perpetually discontented sister, glanced around quickly, a furtive movement, before uncapping the vial and tipping its contents into the lemonade pitcher she'd just refilled. My lemonade pitcher, the one I'd been drinking from all afternoon. She gave it a quick, almost invisible stir with a long spoon before placing the cap back on the vial and slipping it into the pocket of her sundress. My name is Marcus Thorne, 49 years old, and for the past 22 years, I've worked as a senior risk analyst for a major insurance underwriter. My job is to assess threats, identify vulnerabilities, and predict the likelihood of adverse events based on patterns of behavior and available data. Cassandra, in that moment, had just become a high-priority adverse event. I didn't react immediately. No gasp, no sudden movement to betray my observation. I simply continued my conversation with Clara's uncle, discussing the merits of different brands of lawnmowers, while my mind cataloged Cassandra's actions with cold precision. The surreptitious glance, the concealed vial, the targeted addition to my drink, the attempt at a stealthy stir. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. I excused myself from Uncle George, mentioning I needed a refill. As I approached the drinks table, Cassandra turned, a bright, slightly strained smile plastered on her face. "Oh, Marcus, just refilled the lemonade. It's so hot today, isn't it?" Her voice was a little too high-pitched, her eyes a little too wide. Classic indicators of nervousness, of someone trying too hard to appear casual. "It is indeed," I replied, my tone even. I picked up the pitcher. "Looks refreshing." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. My gaze flickered to her husband, Derek, who was lumbering towards us from the barbecue pit, a plate piled high with glistening ribs in one hand and a beer in the other. Derek was Derek, a loud, opinionated man who considered himself an expert on everything from global politics to grilling techniques, despite ample evidence to the contrary. He made a few condescending remarks about my boring desk job earlier, contrasting it with his own dynamic role as a regional sales manager for a struggling auto parts supplier. He'd also conveniently forgotten his wallet when it was his turn to pay for the group's mini-golf outing last month. "Hey, Cassie, pour me some of that, will ya?" Derek boomed, already reaching for a clean glass. "Dying of thirst over here. These ribs are a masterpiece, if I do say so myself." Cassandra hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting from me to Derek and back to the pitcher in my hand. It was a critical decision point for her, and I could almost see the calculations whirring behind her eyes. If she warned Derek, she'd expose herself. If she didn't, her husband would consume whatever concoction she'd intended for me. Before she could speak, I made my move. "Allow me, Derek," I said smoothly, already pouring a generous glass from the pitcher. Cassandra looked like she was about to grab one for herself. I handed the full glass to Derek, whose attention was already drifting towards a passing football. "Much obliged, Marcus," he said, taking a large gulp without a second thought. I watched Cassandra's face. A flicker of something, panic? Frustration? Crossed her features before she masked it with another brittle smile. "Oh yes, of course. You first, honey," she said to Derek, her voice now a little flat. I then poured a small amount into a separate glass for myself, making sure she saw me do it. I didn't drink it, not yet. I simply held it, observing. This was a test. Her reaction to Derek drinking it, and her reaction to me almost drinking it, would provide more data. The initial shock of her action was already receding, replaced by a chillingly familiar analytical process. Why would Cassandra spike my drink? What did she hope to achieve? Was this a childish prank, or something more malicious? Knowing Cassandra, her history of passive-aggressive behavior, her thinly veiled jealousy of Clara's stable life with me, and her constant, low-grade financial desperation, I suspected the latter. This wasn't just about giving me an upset stomach. There was a purpose here, a motive I needed to uncover. And I would. The pieces of the puzzle were already beginning to shift into a new, more disturbing configuration. Derek, meanwhile, had drained half his glass. "Good stuff, Cassie," he declared, smacking his lips. "Hits the spot." Cassandra forced another smile, her eyes fixed on her husband with an intensity that was anything but loving. The barbecue suddenly felt a lot less festive. My mind was already several steps ahead, outlining the initial phases of a discreet investigation. This was no longer a family gathering. It was a data collection exercise. And Cassandra had just become my primary subject. Derek finished his glass of spiked lemonade with a satisfied sigh, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that had suddenly permeated the otherwise cheerful atmosphere of the barbecue. He grabbed another rib from his plate and launched into a monologue about the superiority of his dry rub recipe, completely missing the way Cassandra's gaze kept flicking towards him, her smile frozen in place. I took a tiny, almost imperceptible sip of my own lemonade, just enough to wet my tongue, a feint to maintain the illusion that I suspected nothing. The taste was normal, perhaps a little sweeter than usual, but nothing overtly alarming. Whatever Cassandra had added, it wasn't designed for immediate taste detection. This suggested something more insidious than a simple laxative or bittering agent. It implied a substance intended to work subtly, perhaps to incapacitate or disorient over a short period. Within about 20 minutes, Derek started to look unwell. His booming voice faltered mid-sentence during a particularly self-congratulatory anecdote about a recent major sale he'd supposedly closed. He put a hand to his forehead, his face paling slightly. "Whoa." Feeling a bit woozy all of a sudden, he mumbled, shaking his head as if to clear it. "Must be the heat." Cassandra rushed to his side, her concern a little too theatrical. "Oh, honey, are you okay? Do you need to sit down? Maybe you had too much sun." Her voice was laced with an exaggerated solicitude that set my internal alarms ringing. She was overacting, trying to control the narrative, to attribute his symptoms to an external, innocuous cause. Clara, ever compassionate, also hurried over, her brow furrowed with genuine worry. "Derek, you don't look good at all. Marcus, maybe we should get him inside." "Good idea." I agreed, my eyes on Cassandra. Her hand was on Derek's arm, guiding him towards a shaded lawn chair, but her gaze was fixed on his face, an unreadable expression in her eyes. Was it concern for her husband, or concern that her plan had gone awry and was now unfolding in an unexpected and uncontrollable manner? Derek slumped into the chair, groaning. "My stomach feels like it's doing flips," he said, his voice weaker now. He looked confused, disoriented. His earlier bluster had completely vanished. Several family members gathered around, offering water, fanning him with paper plates. The focus of the barbecue had shifted entirely to Derek's sudden malaise. I used the commotion as an opportunity. While others were fussing over Derek, I discreetly returned to the drinks table. The pitcher of lemonade was still there, about half full. I quickly found an empty plastic water bottle in the recycling bin, rinsed it out, and poured a substantial sample from the pitcher into it, capping it tightly. I slipped the bottle into the cooler bag where I kept my car keys out of sight. Evidence preservation. It was a standard first step in any analysis of an unexpected adverse event. Cassandra, meanwhile, was playing the part of the devoted wife, dabbing Derek's forehead with a damp napkin, murmuring soothing words. But her eyes kept darting around, assessing the reactions of the family members, particularly Clara and me. She looked flustered, her composure cracking. This was not how she had envisioned this scenario playing out. Her target had been me. The intended effect was unknown, but the actual effect on Derek was now a public spectacle. He was clearly in distress, his initial wooziness progressing to nausea. He doubled over, retching into a bush, much to the horror of Clara's Aunt Mildred. Cassandra's attempts to calm him seemed to only agitate him further. "Just leave me alone," he gasped, pushing her hand away. "Need air." The family collectively decided that Derek needed to go home. Cassandra, looking increasingly panicked, agreed. Yes, I'll take him. He just needs to lie down." Her eagerness to remove him from the scene was palpable. As they made their apologies and began their retreat, Derek leaning heavily on Cassandra, I caught her eye. Just for a second, there was a flash of something there. Anger? Fear? Accusation? It was hard to tell, but it was potent. She knew, or at least suspected, that I knew something. My calm, observant demeanor, my lack of overt surprise at Derek's sudden illness, might have been more unsettling to her than an outright accusation would have been. After they left, a worried buzz settled over the remaining guests. Food poisoning was the general consensus, though Clara privately mentioned to me that Derek had eaten the same ribs as everyone else, and no one else was sick. It's strange, she'd said, frowning. He looked fine 1 minute and then just collapsed. These things happen, I'd replied noncommittally. Maybe it was something he ate earlier, or just too much sun and rich food. I didn't want to alarm Clara. Not yet. I needed more information, a clearer understanding of Cassandra's motives, before I brought my wife into this. The potential for family implosion was too high. Later that evening, after the last guest had departed and Clara was tidying up, I retrieved the lemonade sample from the cooler. I labeled it carefully with the date and time and placed it in the back of our garage refrigerator, a secondary fridge we use for drinks and overflow, a place it was unlikely to be disturbed. My mind was already working through the possibilities. What could Cassandra have used? A common over-the-counter medication in a high dose? Something more illicit? And why? What was the endgame? Was she trying to make me ill? To embarrass me? To discredit me in front of the family? Or was it something more sinister? Was she trying to get me out of the way, even temporarily, for some specific purpose? The questions multiplied, each one leading to more complex scenarios. I thought back to Cassandra's recent behavior, her constant complaints about her and Derek's financial situation, despite their reasonably good incomes. Her subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, digs at my own financial prudence, which she often framed as me being stingy or unadventurous. Her fascination with Clara's inheritance from her grandmother, a modest sum that Cassandra seemed to believe was a king's ransom. There was a pattern of envy, of grasping, of a belief that others had it easier, that she was somehow entitled to more. This wasn't just about a single act of malice at a barbecue. This was likely a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive dysfunction. And if she was desperate enough to spike a drink, what else was she capable of? The need for a quiet, thorough investigation was paramount. I couldn't rely on assumptions or emotional reactions. I needed facts, data, and a clear understanding of the risk Cassandra now represented, not just to me, but potentially to Clara as well. The first step would be to get the lemonade sample analyzed. I had to contact a former colleague who now ran a private toxicology lab. It would cost me, but the information would be invaluable. The game, as they say, was afoot, and Cassandra had no idea how thoroughly I intended to play it. The day after the barbecue, I contacted Dr. Alastair Finch, my former colleague who now ran a reputable private toxicology lab in the city. Alastair was discreet and highly competent, exactly what I needed. I explained I had a beverage sample I needed analyzed for any unusual substances, framing it as a personal matter involving a potential accidental contamination, avoiding any mention of Cassandra or intentional spiking for now. He agreed to run a comprehensive screen. I couriered the sealed, labeled sample to his lab that morning, requesting a rush analysis. With that crucial step underway, I turned my attention to Cassandra herself. I needed to understand her current life situation, her stressors, her potential motives, beyond the general dissatisfaction she always seemed to exude. Clara, still concerned about Derek's sudden illness, called Cassandra to check in. I listened quietly to Clara's side of the conversation. "Oh, he's still not feeling great. Just a stomach bug, you think?" "Yes, it was probably just too much rich food." "Well, tell him we hope he feels better soon." After she hung up, Clara sighed. "Cassandra says Derek is still very weak, but she's sure it's just a 24-hour bug." She sounded a bit frazzled. An interesting data point. Was it the stress of dealing with a sick husband, or the stress of her plan backfiring and the fear of exposure? My working hypothesis leaned towards the latter. I began a discreet dive into Cassandra's digital footprint, something I could do from my home office without raising any alarms. Public social media profiles, any mentions in local news or community forums, LinkedIn, if she even maintained one. Her social media was a curated highlight reel, as most are, carefully posed photos, cheerful updates about minor accomplishments, a lot of inspirational quotes that seemed at odds with her general demeanor. There was little of substance, but one thing stood out: a recent flurry of posts about new beginnings and taking control of one's destiny, often accompanied by hashtags related to entrepreneurship and financial independence. This was a new development. Cassandra had never shown much inclination towards genuine entrepreneurship, preferring to lament her job prospects or rely on Derek's income and periodic loans from Clara. I cross-referenced these posts with any online business registries or local startup forums. I found a recently registered sole proprietorship under Cassandra's name, Cassie's Curated Collections, an online boutique ostensibly selling artisanal crafts and vintage jewelry. The website was rudimentary, with stock photos and very few actual products listed. It looked more like an idea than a functioning business. More digging revealed that the business registration address was a P.O. box, and the contact number was her personal cell. There were no customer reviews, no significant online presence beyond the hastily constructed website and a few generic social media posts. It had all the hallmarks of shell, a front for something else, or perhaps just another of Cassandra's half-baked schemes destined for failure. But why the sudden entrepreneurial zeal? And how did it connect, if at all, to the incident at the barbecue? My risk analyst brain started constructing scenarios. Scenario A. The new business was legitimate but failing, increasing her financial desperation and leading to a reckless act aimed at me for some perceived slight or financial gain, though how spiking my drink would achieve that was unclear. Scenario B. The business was a front for something less savory, and I had somehow become a threat or an obstacle. Scenario C. The business was a pipe dream, and her frustration with her own lack of success, contrasted with Clara's comfortable life with me, had boiled over into a malicious act. I needed more data. I decided to leverage Clara's concern for her sister. "Clara," I said later that day, "I was thinking about Cassandra. You said she sounded frazzled. And all those posts about her new business. Do you know how it's actually going? Is she okay financially?" Clara frowned. "Honestly, Marcus, I don't really know. She's very vague about it. She asked me for a rather large loan a few weeks ago to invest in inventory, as she put it. I gave her some, not as much as she wanted. I told her Derek should be contributing more if it's a joint venture." "Did she say if Derek was involved?" I asked. "No. She made it sound like it was her own thing. She said Derek wasn't very supportive, that he didn't understand her vision." This was interesting. If Derek wasn't supportive and potentially wasn't even aware of the extent of her investment, it could explain some of the tension between them, and perhaps some of Cassandra's desperation. What if the inventory wasn't artisanal crafts, but something else entirely? What if she was in over her head with something, and the spiked drink was an attempt to, what? Distract? Incapacitate me to gain access to something in our home? The motive remained elusive, but the picture of Cassandra as someone under significant, self-inflicted pressure was becoming clearer. Alistair called me late the next afternoon. "Marcus got the preliminary results on that lemonade sample," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It's interesting." "Interesting how?" I asked, my pen hovering over a notepad. No common toxins, no illicit substances, nothing overtly poisonous in a lethal sense. However, we found a significant concentration of a potent, fast-acting benzodiazepine, specifically lorazepam, and at a dosage that would typically be prescribed for severe anxiety or as a preoperative sedative. Lorazepam, a powerful sedative. If I had consumed that glass, I would likely have become extremely drowsy, disoriented, perhaps even unconscious within 30 minutes to an hour. My mind raced. What would have happened if I'd been incapacitated at the barbecue? In front of my family? What was Cassandra's plan? Would she have played the concerned hostess, helping me into the house, perhaps into our bedroom? And then what? The implications were deeply unsettling. This wasn't a prank. This was a calculated attempt to render me helpless. The question now was, to what end? The why had just become significantly more urgent. The confirmation from Alistair that the lemonade contained a high dose of lorazepam sent a chill down my spine. This escalated Cassandra's actions from malicious mischief to something far more sinister. Incapacitating me with a potent sedative at a family gathering wasn't just about causing embarrassment or illness. It was about creating a window of opportunity. For what? I still wasn't entirely sure, but the possibilities were deeply disturbing. My immediate concern was Clara. If Cassandra was capable of this, she posed a significant threat, and Clara, with her trusting nature, was particularly vulnerable. I needed to decide how and when to reveal this to her. But first, I felt compelled to understand the full scope of Cassandra's desperation and the potential endgame of her Cassie's curated collections venture. The benzodiazepine findings strongly suggested she needed me out of the way for a specific short-term purpose. Could it be related to accessing something in our house? My financial documents? Or perhaps creating a scenario where she could manipulate Clara or stage some kind scenario for emergency to her advantage. I reviewed our home security system again, focusing on the days leading up to the barbecue, specifically when Cassandra had been visiting. There was nothing overtly suspicious beyond what I'd already noted, her general nosiness. However, I did notice she spent a significant amount of time on her phone, often looking stressed or agitated during these calls. Were these calls with creditors? Or was someone else involved in her schemes? The thought of a potential accomplice hadn't seriously occurred to me until now. But if her business was more than just a failing online boutique, it was a possibility. My next step was to discreetly examine our home office, the place where I kept important documents, my work laptop, and our personal computer. I was meticulous about security, with strong passwords and encrypted files for sensitive information. But Cassandra had seen me working in there. She knew it was my command center. I waited until Clara was at her book club, and I was ostensibly working from home. I first checked for any signs of tampering with my physical files or my desktop computer. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, I ran a deep diagnostic on our home network and my primary computer, looking for any unusual access attempts, malware, or keyloggers. My security software was robust, but a sophisticated attempt might leave subtle traces. The scan came back clean. However, I did find something interesting in the browsing history of our shared family tablet, which Cassandra often used when she visited. There were multiple searches for terms like how to bypass Windows password, default router admin logins, and, more alarmingly, effects of lorazepam on adults and undetectable sedatives. These searches had occurred in the week leading up to the barbecue. This was damning. It showed premeditation, research. She hadn't just impulsively grabbed a pill from a medicine cabinet. She had actively sought out information on sedatives and how to circumvent basic digital security. The pieces were falling into place, forming a disturbing mosaic of deceit and malevolent intent. Cassandra wasn't just envious or financially desperate in a general way. She seemed to be executing a specific, albeit poorly conceived, plan. The lorazepam was meant to incapacitate me. The computer searches suggested she intended to access my digital information. The Cassie's curated collections might be a front, or simply a symptom of her chaotic attempts to generate cash, possibly to fund something larger or pay off someone. I considered the possibility that her target wasn't just my financial information, but perhaps something that could damage my reputation or my career, something she could use as leverage. As a risk analyst for a major insurer, I handled sensitive client data and proprietary algorithms. A breach could have severe consequences. It was time to talk to Clara. I couldn't keep this from her any longer, not with the evidence mounting to this degree. The risk to her, if Cassandra became more desperate, or if there was indeed an accomplice, was too great. I decided to approach it carefully, presenting the facts logically without immediate accusation, allowing her to reach her own conclusions as much as possible, though I knew it would be a shock. That evening, after dinner, I asked Clara to sit with me in the living room. I told her I had something serious to discuss, something that concerned Cassandra. I saw the familiar flicker of apprehension in her eyes, the preemptive defense of her sister already forming. "Marcus, what is it? Is Cassandra okay?" "She's fine, physically, as far as I know," I began. "But I've discovered some things that are deeply troubling, and I need you to hear me out and look at what I've found before you jump to any conclusions." I started with the lemonade, with Alistair's toxicology report. I showed her the official lab document, highlighting the lorazepam finding and explaining its effects. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Lorazepam? But who would?" "I believe Cassandra put it in the lemonade, Clara. Specifically, in the pitcher she knew I was drinking from." I then recounted my observation of her at the drinks table, her furtive actions. Clara shook her head, a knot forming between her brows. "No, Marcus, there must be a mistake. Cassandra wouldn't. She might be flighty and irresponsible sometimes, but she wouldn't poison you. It wasn't poison in the lethal sense, Clara. It was a sedative, a powerful one." I then showed her the tablet's browser history, the searches for sedatives, for bypassing passwords. Her face grew paler with each screenshot. This can't be right. There must be an explanation." "There's an explanation, Clara," I said gently but firmly. "And I think it's one we need to face together." The conversation was just beginning, and I knew it would be long and painful. But the truth, however ugly, had to come out. The integrity of our life, our trust, depended on it. Clara stared at the tablet screen, her knuckles white as she gripped its edges. The browser history, with Cassandra's damning searches for sedatives and password bypasses, lay bare between us. I don't understand, Marcus. Why would she do this? What could she possibly gain by drugging you?" Her voice was a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, horrified comprehension. This was the critical juncture. I had to guide her through the data I'd collected, connecting the dots in a way that was logical and undeniable, yet sensitive to the fact that this was her sister we were discussing. "I've been trying to piece that together, Clara," I said, keeping my tone measured. "Remember how Derek was so ill at the barbecue? He drank the lemonade Cassandra had just poured, the one she likely intended for me." Realization flickered in her eyes. "You think, if you had drunk it, you would have been like Derek or worse?" Alistair's report said the dosage was significant. It would have caused severe drowsiness, disorientation, very likely unconsciousness for several hours. I paused, letting that sink in. Now consider this. If I were incapacitated here at a family event, what opportunities might that create for someone like Cassandra, someone who's been, let's say, curious about our finances? I then carefully walked her through my observations of Cassandra's recent behavior. Her increasing financial requests, the vague Cassie's curated collections business, her subtle but persistent inquiries about our assets, and the incident where I suspected she'd try to access my computer in the study. I didn't present these as accusations, but as data points, patterns of behavior. Clara listened, her initial shock giving way to a troubled silence. She was processing, her intelligent mind, usually clouded by familial loyalty where Cassandra was concerned, now grappling with uncomfortable facts. "She did ask me some strange questions about your investment portfolio last month," Clara admitted slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "She said she was trying to learn about managing money for her business. I thought it was a positive sign that she was finally trying to be responsible. And the loan you gave her for inventory," I prompted gently. "Did she ever show you any of this inventory? Or any actual business plans?" Clara shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "No, she was always very vague. Said it was proprietary information until she launched properly." "Oh, Marcus, have I been a complete fool?" "You've been a loving sister, Clara," I said, taking her hand. "Cassandra is very adept at exploiting that love and trust. That's not your failing, it's hers." We talked for hours that night. I didn't push her. I simply presented the information I had, answered her questions honestly, and allowed her to navigate her own emotional turmoil. There was anger, there was profound sadness, there was a deep sense of betrayal. By the early hours of the morning, the initial shock had subsided, replaced by a grim resolve. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "This can't just be ignored. If she's capable of this, what's next?" That's what we need to figure out, I said. My primary concern is our safety and our security. We need to understand if she's acting alone, or if this business of hers, or her financial desperation, involves anyone else who might also pose a threat. This was the opening I needed to suggest a more proactive approach. I think we need to understand more about Cassie's curated collections and who she might be involved with, I proposed. If she's this desperate, it's possible she's entangled in something she can't control. Clara, now fully convinced of her sister's duplicity, agreed. The rose-tinted glasses were off. She was seeing Cassandra with the clear, sharp vision of someone whose trust had been profoundly violated. Over the next few days, Clara became my silent partner in observation. She didn't confront Cassandra, but her interactions with her sister took on a new, subtle caution. She made excuses to avoid lending more money, citing joint financial decisions she needed to discuss with me. She began to notice things she'd previously dismissed. Cassandra's evasiveness about her daily activities, her hushed phone calls, the expensive new handbag that seemed at odds with her supposed financial struggles. Meanwhile, I focused on Cassie's curated collections. The rudimentary website offered little, but I managed to trace the web hosting and domain registration. The payments for these services were made from a prepaid credit card, difficult to link directly to a bank account without a subpoena. However, I noticed that the few artisanal crafts pictured on the site bore a striking resemblance to mass-produced items available on large overseas e-commerce platforms, just with a significantly higher price tag. This wasn't a legitimate boutique. It was at best a poorly executed drop-shipping scheme, or at worst, a front for something else entirely. I also revisited the idea of an accomplice. Cassandra's research into sedatives and password cracking, while alarming, seemed a little too sophisticated for her usual level of haphazard planning. Was someone advising her? Guiding her? The benzodiazepine wasn't something you could easily buy over the counter. Had she obtained it illicitly? Or did she have access through a medical professional, perhaps by feigning symptoms? Clara, recalling Cassandra's frequent complaints about anxiety and insomnia, remembered Cassandra mentioning a new doctor she'd found, one who was much more understanding than her previous physicians. This was another thread to pull. If Cassandra had manipulated a doctor into prescribing such medication, it spoke to a higher level of premeditation and deceit. We decided that Clara would try to engage Cassandra in a seemingly casual conversation about her business and her well-being, hoping Cassandra might let something slip, especially if she felt her usual source of funds, Clara, was drying up. The trap wasn't fully set, but the bait was being carefully prepared. We needed Cassandra to reveal more of her hand, to expose the full extent of her desperation and the network, if any, she was operating within. The goal was not just to stop her, but to understand the entire threat landscape she represented. Clara's carefully orchestrated conversation with Cassandra took place a few days later. I wasn't present, as we felt Cassandra might be more guarded with me around. Clara chose a moment when they were alone, ostensibly looking at old family photo albums, a deliberately sentimental setting. Clara reported back to me that evening, her expression a mixture of sadness and steely resolve. "She's definitely desperate, Marcus," Clara began. I told her we were tightening our budget, saving for some home renovations, and that I wouldn't be able to help her out for the foreseeable future. She didn't take it well. According to Clara, Cassandra had initially tried to guilt-trip her, reminding Clara of all the time she'd been there for her, a narrative Clara now saw as highly selective. When that didn't work, Cassandra became agitated, speaking vaguely of important investors for her business who were expecting a return and how she was under a lot of pressure to make Cassie's curated collections a success quickly. She'd even hinted that if things didn't improve, she might have to make some drastic decisions. The mention of investors was a red flag. Given the flimsy nature of her online boutique, it was highly unlikely she had legitimate investors. This sounded more like she owed money to someone, possibly someone less than scrupulous. This connected with my earlier suspicion of a potential accomplice or someone guiding her. Did she mention any names? I asked. Clara shook her head. No, she was very cagey. But she did let slip that her new doctor had been so helpful with her stress, prescribing something that really helped her sleep and calm her nerves. She even joked that it was strong enough to knock out a horse. Lorazepam, almost certainly, and potentially obtained under false pretenses. This was a critical piece of information. If Cassandra had doctor-shopped or exaggerated symptoms to obtain a controlled substance, and then used it to spike my drink, the legal implications for her were severe. This was no longer just a family drama. It was potentially a criminal matter. I decided it was time to leverage my professional network more directly, but with extreme caution. I had a contact, a former colleague named Ben Carter, who had left the insurance industry to become a licensed private investigator. Ben was exceptionally discreet and had a knack for financial investigations and uncovering hidden connections. I met with Ben, laying out the situation in hypothetical terms initially, speaking of a friend who suspected a relative of financial exploitation and possible illicit activities. As I detailed the evidence, the spiked drink, the toxicology report, the suspicious business, the potential medication fraud, and now, the mention of mysterious investors, Ben's expression grew serious. "Marcus, this friend of yours is dealing with something that could be very dangerous," Ben said. "The combination of financial desperation, deceit, and the use of controlled substances is a volatile mix. These investors could be loan sharks or worse." He agreed to do some preliminary and strictly legal background work on Cassandra, focusing on her financial transactions, public records, any unusual credit activity, if ethically discoverable, and trying to identify these supposed investors or any known associates who fit a predatory profile. He would also look into the doctor Cassandra had mentioned, if Clara could recall the name, to see if there were any patterns of overprescribing or disciplinary actions. Though patient confidentiality would limit direct access, public records sometimes revealed problem practitioners. Clara, after some thought, did remember the doctor's name, a Dr. Alastair Finch. My heart skipped a beat. Alastair Finch was the name of the toxicologist who had analyzed the lemonade sample. This couldn't be a coincidence. My Alastair Finch was a highly respected professional. Was Cassandra using his name falsely? Or was there another Dr. Alastair Finch, a less scrupulous one? Or, most disturbingly, was there a compromised individual within my Alastair's lab or network? This new variable added a complex and potentially dangerous layer. I immediately called Alastair, the toxicologist. I explained the new development, the mention of his name by the person I suspected of the drink spiking. Alastair was audibly shocked. "Marcus, there is no other Dr. Alastair Finch practicing internal medicine or psychiatry in this state that I'm aware of, and certainly not one I'd want my name confused with. I haven't prescribed medication in 20 years. My work is strictly analytical. This is deeply concerning." He promised to check his lab's internal security protocols and access logs immediately to see if there had been any unauthorized information leaks or if his name or credentials had been compromised in any way that Cassandra could have exploited. He also mentioned that his lab did occasionally consult with physicians, but always under strict confidentiality agreements. The plot was thickening considerably. Cassandra wasn't just a desperate, manipulative individual. She was now potentially linked to a misuse of a respected professional's identity, or worse, a deeper conspiracy. Ben Carter, my PI contact, now had a new, urgent avenue to investigate. Any connection between Cassandra and Alastair Finch's lab, or anyone who might be falsely representing him or his credentials. The focus shifted. Was Cassandra's doctor real, or was the name of fabrication she used, and if so, why Alastair's name? Had she somehow learned of my connection to him, or was this a bizarre, unrelated coincidence that was about to unravel something even more complex? The stakes had just been raised significantly. My quiet investigation into a family matter was now touching on potential professional misconduct and identity theft. I needed to proceed with even greater caution. The next step was to see what Ben could uncover about this Dr. Finch Cassandra was seeing, and any links back to her mysterious investors or her increasingly desperate financial situation. The carefully laid bait was attracting more than just Cassandra. It was beginning to illuminate a much larger, murkier pond. Ben Carter's investigation into the Dr. Alastair Finch, Cassandra claimed to be seeing yielded results faster than I anticipated, and they were both bizarre and revealing. There was indeed another Dr. Alastair Finch in a neighboring state, a psychiatrist who had a string of disciplinary actions against him for overprescribing controlled substances and improper patient relationships. His license had been suspended twice. It seemed Cassandra had likely found this disgraced doctor online, perhaps through forums catering to those seeking easy access to prescription drugs, and had co-opted his name, or was genuinely seeing him long distance via loosely regulated telehealth services. This explained her access to lorazepam and her confidence in its efficacy. She wasn't manipulating a local, respected doctor. She was either exploiting a compromised one or simply using his name as a cover. This discovery, while clarifying Cassandra's source, also deepened my concern about her recklessness and the company she might be keeping, virtually or otherwise. Simultaneously, Alastair, my toxicologist friend, confirmed that his lab security was intact. There had been no breaches, no unauthorized access to my case file. It appeared the name overlap was a disturbing coincidence, one that Cassandra had either stumbled upon or been fed. Ben then turned his attention to Cassandra's investors and her Cassie's curated collections venture. By cross-referencing public business filings with known associates of the disgraced Dr. Finch and individuals involved in online scams, Ben began to sketch a shadowy network. Cassie's curated collections, as suspected, was a shell, but it seemed to be one of several such shells linked to a small-time con artist named Julian Vance. Vance specialized in convincing vulnerable individuals to invest in sham businesses, often using them as fronts to launder small amounts of money or to recruit others into multi-level marketing schemes that bordered on fraud. He typically promised high returns and an extravagant lifestyle, preying on people's financial desperation and desire for a quick fix. Cassandra, with her constant money troubles and grandiose ambitions, was a perfect target for someone like Vance. Ben found evidence of several wire transfers from Cassandra's personal account, the one Clara had been unknowingly funding, to accounts associated with Vance, disguised as consulting fees or initial investments. It appeared Cassandra hadn't just borrowed money from Clara for a legitimate, if ill-fated, business. She had been funneling it to Vance, likely under the illusion that she was investing in a lucrative partnership. Vance was her investor, or rather, she was his unwitting, or perhaps partially witting, pawn and cash cow. The pressure Cassandra felt was likely from Vance, demanding more money or for her to deliver on some promised return, perhaps by bringing in other investors or accessing new sources of funds. This painted her attempt to incapacitate me in a new light. If she could gain access to my financial accounts, or create a situation where Clara might inherit or control more assets, Vance would be the ultimate beneficiary. Cassandra was a desperate woman being squeezed by a predator, and in her desperation, she had become predatory herself. The sedated drink was not just an act of malice against me. It was a high-stakes move, possibly dictated or heavily influenced by Vance, to solve her financial woes and appease him. I now had a much clearer picture. Cassandra, deeply in debt and entangled with a con artist, had researched sedatives, obtained lorazepam, likely through the disgraced Dr. Finch or a similar source, and attempted to incapacitate me to gain access to our finances, all likely under duress or manipulation from Julian Vance. It was a sordid, desperate mess. It was time to consolidate this information and prepare for a final confrontation. The goal was no longer just to expose Cassandra to Clara and her parents, but to neutralize the threat posed by Vance and ensure Cassandra faced the consequences of her actions in a way that might prevent her from harming others, or herself, further. I asked Ben to compile a comprehensive report on Julian Vance, his methods, and his known associates, including any past victims who might be willing to cooperate or provide testimony if legal action became necessary against him. I also asked him to see if there was any traceable link between Vance and the disgraced Dr. Finch. Con artists often operate in loose networks. With this new, more dangerous element in play, my priority shifted slightly. While protecting Clara and our assets was still paramount, I also felt a responsibility to ensure that Vance's predatory activities were, if possible, disrupted. Cassandra was a victim of her own poor choices and greed, but Vance was a deliberate exploiter. The final act of this drama would require careful staging. I needed to create a scenario where Cassandra's entire web of deceit would unravel, preferably in a way that also implicated Vance, or at least provided enough evidence for authorities to take an interest in him. The upcoming charity gala that Clara's hospital was hosting in 3 weeks presented a potential opportunity. Cassandra, always eager for an excuse to dress up and mingle, would undoubtedly want to attend, especially if she thought she could project an image of success or solicit more fun for her business. Perhaps Julian Vance might even be convinced to make an appearance if he thought influential, wealthy people would be there, prime targets for his schemes. The plan was beginning to form, more complex and with higher stakes than I had initially envisioned. This was no longer just about a family betrayal. It was about dismantling a small-time criminal enterprise that had ensnared my sister-in-law. The hospital charity gala was indeed the perfect stage. Cassandra, when Clara casually mentioned it, practically begged for an invitation, talking about the networking opportunities for Cassie's curated collections. Clara, playing her part beautifully, feigned reluctance before generously offering to get her a ticket. Our unspoken hope was that Cassandra might try to impress Julian Vance by bringing him, or at least talk about him enough to further incriminate herself for him. Ben Carter, meanwhile, had solidified the link between Cassandra and Julian Vance. Vance had a history of attending such charity events, not as a donor, but as a predator, looking for wealthy, often older and lonelier, individuals to charm and eventually defraud. He often used attractive, younger associates like Cassandra as bait or as initial points of contact. Ben also discovered that Vance was currently under investigation in another state for investment fraud, though no charges had yet been filed. This made him a flight risk if he suspected exposure. The plan was multi-layered. Phase 1, the gala. I arranged with the event security, whom my firm coincidentally used for corporate events, for discreet surveillance of Cassandra and anyone she was with. Ben would also be there, posing as a guest, equipped to gather any further evidence. Clara and I would observe Cassandra, noting her interactions. Phase 2, the intervention. The day after the gala, we would arrange a family meeting, Clara, her parents, and me, with Cassandra. This time, we wouldn't just present the evidence of her actions against us, but also the information about Julian Vance and how he was likely manipulating her. The goal was to force Cassandra to confront the reality of her situation and, ideally, to cooperate in providing information against Vance. Phase 3, legal action. Depending on Cassandra's cooperation and the evidence gathered, we would consult with our lawyer, Sarah Chun, and potentially law enforcement regarding Vance. As for Cassandra, her fate would depend heavily on her willingness to acknowledge her wrongdoing and extricate herself from Vance's influence. On the night of the gala, Cassandra arrived looking like $1 million, or rather, like someone desperately trying to look like $1 million. She was wearing a new, expensive-looking gown, likely bought with Clara's loan money, and an air of forced confidence. She scanned the room constantly, not with the ease of a genuine guest, but with the three eyes of someone looking for a mark, or perhaps for a handler. Julian Vance did not make an appearance, much to my initial disappointment. However, Cassandra spent a significant portion of the evening on her phone, stepping away for hushed, agitated conversations. Ben, with his long-lens camera and discreet audio enhancers, used legally in the public space of the gala, managed to capture snippets of these calls. They were clearly with Vance. He was pressuring her, demanding results, asking if she'd made any progress with the sister or the boring husband. He sounded angry and threatening. Cassandra, in turn, sounded increasingly desperate, making excuses, promising him she had a new plan. This was gold. After one particularly tense call, Cassandra approached a wealthy widower, a prominent local businessman known for his philanthropy, and began an overly charming, almost aggressive conversation, clearly trying to solicit an investment for her boutique. The interaction was so transparently manipulative that the businessman quickly excused himself, looking uncomfortable. Ben captured all. The next morning, we convened the family meeting at Clara's parents' house. Cassandra arrived, looking pale and defensive. I began by calmly laying out all the evidence we had gathered since the barbecue. The toxicology report, the tablet search history, her attempts to access my computer, the details of Cassie's curated collections being a shell, and finally, the comprehensive report on Julian Vance, including his criminal background and modus operandi. I then played the audio snippets Ben had captured at the gala. Vance's threats, Cassandra's desperate replies, her talk of a new plan. Cassandra sat in stunned silence, her face ashen. This time, there were no denials, no attempts to deflect blame. The sheer weight of the evidence, particularly the recordings of her conversations with Vance, was overwhelming. Clara spoke next, her voice firm but filled with a deep sorrow. Cassie, this man, Julian Vance, he's a con artist. He's using you. He doesn't care about you or your business. He's just after money. Our money. Anyone's money he can get his hands on. And you, in your desperation to impress him or pay him back, you were willing to drug your own brother-in-law, to try and steal from us, to destroy our family. Her parents echoed Clara's sentiments, expressing their profound disappointment and fear for Cassandra's safety. Faced with the undeniable truth and the united front of her family, Cassandra finally broke. She confessed everything. Her involvement with Vance, the money she'd given him, the pressure he was putting on her, her fear of him. She admitted that the idea to spike my drink had been subtly suggested by Vance as a way to create an opportunity to access my financial information, which Vance believed was substantial. She hadn't fully understood the risks, she claimed, and was terrified of what Vance might do if she didn't deliver. It was a pathetic, tearful confession, but it felt genuine, born of fear and the crushing weight of her mistakes. Our lawyer, Sarah Chun, whom we had asked to be present, then explained the legal ramifications Cassandra was facing, potential charges for assault, for the drugging, computer fraud, and conspiracy. However, Sarah also offered a path forward. If Cassandra agreed to cooperate fully with law enforcement in their investigation against Julian Vance, and if she sought professional help for her own issues, we would not press charges ourselves, though we couldn't control what the authorities or Vance's other victims might do. Cassandra, broken and terrified, agreed immediately. She provided Sarah and Ben, who joined the meeting at this point, with all the information she had on Vance, his contact details, account numbers she'd sent money to, copies of their communications. It was a wealth of information that Ben believed would be highly valuable to the ongoing investigation against Vance in the other state, and potentially open up a new one here. The intervention had worked better than I could have hoped. Cassandra was, for the moment, neutralized and hopefully on a path to some kind of redemption, however long and difficult. And Julian Vance, the puppet master, was now firmly in the crosshairs. The aftermath of the family intervention was complex and emotionally charged. Cassandra, stripped of her deceptions and facing the stark reality of her situation, agreed to every condition laid out. She moved into a small, rented room, severing all ties with Julian Vance, or so we hoped. She began therapy and, under Sarah Chen's guidance, prepared a comprehensive statement for the authorities regarding Vance's activities. Ben Carter liaised with law enforcement in our state and the state where Vance was already under investigation, providing them with Cassandra's testimony and the evidence he had gathered. It turned out Vance had a much wider network of victims than initially thought, and Cassandra's information helped connect several disparate cases. Weeks later, we learned that Julian Vance had been arrested while attempting to flee the country. The evidence against him, bolstered significantly by Cassandra's cooperation, was substantial. He faced multiple charges of fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. His predatory career was, for all intents and purposes, over. Cassandra's journey was just beginning. She faced a long road of rebuilding her life, facing the consequences of her actions, which included significant debt and a tarnished reputation. though she avoided criminal charges due to her cooperation and attempting to repair the profound damage she had inflicted on her family relationships. Clara maintained a very distant, cautious contact with her, offering moral support for her recovery efforts, but making it clear that trust would take a very long time, if ever, to rebuild. Our lives, Clara's and mine, slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but was a new normal, one forged in the crucible of betrayal and fortified by a shared understanding of the darker aspects of human nature. Our marriage, paradoxically, had grown stronger. We had faced a significant threat together, communicated openly, and acted as a team. The quiet, analytical approach I had taken, which Clara had initially found frustrating, had ultimately protected us and brought the truth to light in an undeniable way. She often said, with a wry smile, that she was grateful to be married to a human lie detector with a penchant for spreadsheets. A few months later, Alistair Finch, the toxicologist, called me. "Marcus, a bit of follow-up on that lorazepam incident. The disgraced Dr. Finch in the neighboring state? He's been arrested. Turns out he was part of a larger ring illegally distributing prescription medications. Cassandra's name, or rather, the name she was using with him, came up in their investigation.